meditations of our hearts be acceptable to thee, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Daughter against mother, real mother against subordinate mother. Today we have the story of Hagar, and I can't resist digging into it a little bit. Hagar is not often preached on, and she deserves a sermon. She's a very holy woman and the mother of many nations, but we don't hear about her very often. She is an irregular mother, as many of Jesus' ancestors were irregular mothers. There's Ruth, Rahab, got some different ones in there. So let's listen to what happens to Hagar. Hagar was Sarah's slave, and in this reading we hear that she is slave many times. That is said to emphasize her position in the family, even though she gave birth to Abraham's first child. That child belongs to Abraham, and it is said to be born of Sarah, just because Sarah was his first wife and the one who the promise came to. But the reading today kind of plays around with all of these positions and gives a new holiness to Hagar. Hagar was offered to Abraham by Sarah to be the surrogate mother of a child. As we know, Abraham and Sarah were as old as dirt, and they hadn't conceived yet. And Sarah gave up on the chances of ever conceiving, and so she connived a little bit. She didn't trust God. She just figured it out on her own. She said, I know what I'll do. I'll take my slave, Hagar, and offer her to Abraham, and she will conceive, and that will be my child. And legally, she could do this. So that's what happened, and Hagar conceived. Once Hagar conceived, Sarah wasn't so happy anymore. She became very jealous and angry and oppressed her. And that word is very important in our story. She oppressed Sarah miserably. We don't know, but it was quite a large abuse. So that Hagar ran away. She ran into the wilderness. So this little story we have today is not the first time that Hagar has been alone in the wilderness. She ran into the wilderness right after she had conceived, after Sarah oppressed her, and she talked to God, and God gave her an audience. She had an annunciation experience very similar to what happened to Mary, very similar to what happened to many of our ancestors. This was the first annunciation that happens in our Bible, the first one in Genesis. And the angel appears to her and says, yes, you have conceived, and you are to name your child Ishmael. Ishmael means God hears. And Hagar was so taken aback that God should visit her, and she was not obliterated by the fire and smoke. She was able to see God in the person of an angel, that she said, oh, my Lord and my God. And she named God. She gave a name to God, which was El Roy. It means God sees. We don't hear about that very often, do we? She's the first woman to give a name to God, El Roy. God sees. So remember that. That's important in our story too. And God tells her, because your child is going to be the father of many, many, many nations, you are to go back and submit to your oppressor, Sarah, and stay until it is time for you to leave. So she goes back, and that sets the stage for the story we have today. Once again, Sarah's jealousy is roused, and it doesn't make sense exactly what she's so jealous of. It says in our text that Isaac means laughter, remember? Sarah laughed, and so did Abraham, when they conceived a child at the age of 100 plus. So laughter is the name of Isaac. The person who's laughing in this story is Ishmael. Ishmael laughing irritates Sarah because that's Isaac's name. He's the one that gets to laugh, not this usurper. That is taking not only his name, what his name means, but taking the position of firstborn, which he is. And he's laughing. And Sarah reads dark things into this, and she's very angry, and she goes running to Abraham and says, Abraham, get rid of this woman and her child. And this is where we start a parallel of story between Abraham and Hagar. What Abraham experiences directly mirrors what happens to Hagar. First of all, Abraham is grieved to the heart at what Sarah is asking him to do, sending away his firstborn child, Ishmael, whom he loves, and I'm sure there's a love relationship between him and Hagar. He has taken her as an additional wife. But God appears to him, just as God appears to Hagar, and God says to him, don't worry about it. Your son Ishmael is going to be fine, and you're going to have many, many nations from this line. So he trusts in God. That is Abraham's major duty in his life, is trusting in God. He trusts in God and sends Hagar off. Now notice what he sends her off with. They've just had a feast on the occasion of Isaac being weaned from his mother. All this food, all this feasting, think of that story of the parable son. And I'm sure they had many leftovers. But what does he send Hagar into the desert with? A thin little skin of water and a piece of bread. So we are to get from this that he's sending her out into the wilderness with very few provisions. Probably he knows she's going to die. Or does he? Is he just trusting in God? He casts her out, and the word used is cast her out in the Hebrew. This is exactly what happens to Hagar. First of all, she becomes grieved to the heart, like Abraham did at throwing them out. She grieves to the heart when she sees that the water is all gone and her child is dying. So she sets Ishmael under a bush, casting him aside, same word, and stands afar off so she doesn't have to watch him die. Now, we get lots of visual images from this story, beautiful images. First, of Abraham pointing out into the wilderness, Hagar with her child. We don't know how old he was, but he was old enough to stand up and for her to take his hand, because he takes her hand at the end. And they're walking out into the wilderness to certain death. But we're to see from this also a memory of what happens to the Israelites in the wilderness. We have to remember that the Exodus was the formational story of the Jewish people. Everything before and after the Exodus pointed directly to it. So Hagar, going into the wilderness with her people, her child, is a reflection of what's going to happen to the Jewish people. She's wandering without food. The Israelites wandered without food. Did they experience a miracle near a well? Well, they had water coming from a rock. It was probably better than a well. So this is a little foretaste of what's going to happen to the Egyptians. But both Hagar and Abraham experience this visit from God. God comes to Hagar again, and it says that God heard the voice of the boy. Remember what Ishmael means. God hears. He heard the voice of the boy, even though it's not in our story. Our story doesn't say he uttered a word. It's Hagar who's crying. But what does God do with Hagar? He sees her misery. Remember, she named God. God sees. He sees her misery, and he comes to her and says, do not fear. I'm showing you water. And she sees the water after God shows it to her. He opens her eyes. She's able to give water to her very thirsty child. The child takes her hand, and here's another beautiful image of them walking into the wilderness, not afraid any longer. And sure enough, they run into people. She finds an Israelite for Ishmael to marry, and many, many generations are born from this union. In fact, the Muslims call Hagar and Abraham their ancestors. So we have two very strong characters, Abraham and Hagar. Through their faith, they believe that God will come to those who are oppressed. And God does come to those who are oppressed. Through their faith, we also believe that God comes to those who do not give up, who persevere, who hang in there. They hang in there. They never lose faith, but they're tested beyond their endurance. They suffer. And we have a God who doesn't allow us to suffer, but transforms the suffering into something so magical and beautiful that it turns our lives in new directions. And we give thanksgiving to Hagar.